The morning Dan left for his business trip started the same way most of our mornings did. Quiet but structured, with a pot of coffee already half full by the time I came down, and the same flannel shirt draped over the back of the chair because he never packed it until the last minute and I never asked why. Probably because we both understood that our little routines were the only real glue still holding everything in place. He didn't say much, just handed me the usual yellow sticky note with a short list of reminders. Trash day, clean out the fridge, call the plumber if the downstairs sink starts acting up again, and kissed me on the cheek without looking directly at me, which was fine because it had been like that for a while and neither of us was in the mood to pretend otherwise. When he pulled out of the driveway. I stood at the front window with my arms folded and watched the truck until it turned the corner. And I'll admit, it felt good to have the house to myself again, not because I didn't love him, but because love starts to feel like a shared schedule after enough years. And I just needed a few days without questions about dinner or receipts left on the counter or why I leave the bathroom light on when I read in the tub. By noon, I'd already vacuumed the living room, rearranged the spice rack, watered the plants, and opened the fridge 3 different times without taking anything out. Because the silence in the house wasn't soothing the way it used to be. It was sharp and echoey like the quiet that comes right after someone slams a door. So when the doorbell rang around 2, I jumped a little, not because I was scared, but because no one ever came by unannounced anymore and I wasn't expecting anything or anyone. And when I opened the door and saw Trevor standing there with one backpack and a crooked grin, for a second I didn't recognize him. He'd grown, that much was obvious. Not just in height, but in the way he stood like he wasn't asking permission to take up space. His shoulders relaxed and his voice deeper than I remembered. And the last time I saw him was maybe 2 years ago at a 4th of July cookout, when he barely spoke and spent most of the afternoon hiding behind his phone. Now here he was saying something about his parents being out of town, the dorms not opening for another week, and Dan telling him he could crash here for a few days. And I nodded before even thinking about it because what else was I going to say? No, you can't. Stay in the room I've kept spotless for the daughter who no longer visits? He dropped his bag in the guest room and complimented how nothing in the house had changed, said it still smelled like fabric softener and lemon furniture polish, which made me laugh a little more than it should have. And when I offered him water or coffee, he asked for coffee like he'd already settled in. That night, I made dinner the way I always do when someone visits. A little too much of everything and all from scratch. Not because I wanted to impress him, but because cooking gave me something. To focus on that didn't have to do with how different he looked or how easily he moved around the kitchen like it was his. He offered to do the dishes and I let him, even though I usually don't. And as I stood there drying plates while he rinsed and scrubbed, I caught myself noticing the shape of his forearms and the quiet way he smiled when he worked. Not flirtatious, not even pointed, just calm and present, in a way I hadn't seen in this house for a long time. It was nothing. I told myself, just gratitude and good manners and a young man being helpful. But when I went upstairs that night and washed my face and saw how carefully I'd styled my hair that morning, I had to admit there was a part of me that had noticed more than I meant to, and I wasn't sure what to do with that. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because anything was wrong exactly, but because the air in the house felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier in a way I couldn't explain. I laid in bed with the window cracked open, listening to the occasional car pass by and the wind brush against the siding. For a while, I read the same page of a book over and over, not really absorbing the words. At some point, I got up, walked down the hallway, checked the front door even though I'd already locked it. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Maybe just reassurance that everything was where it should be. The next morning, I stood longer than usual in front of the mirror. I brushed my hair more carefully, added a bit of concealer under my eyes, and chose a blouse that I normally reserved for staff meetings, even though I wasn't working that day. It wasn't about trying to look good. At least that's what I told myself. It was about feeling put together, sharp, awake. That's all. When I came into the kitchen, Trevor was already there, bare feet on the tile, coffee made, leaning casually against the counter like he'd been doing it every morning for years. He poured me a mug without asking how I took it. Somehow he remembered. French roast, splash of almond milk, no sugar. I thanked him and sat down at the table, and we talked about nothing for a while. What he was studying, what music he'd gotten into lately, how annoying his econ professor had been the year before. He had a rhythm to the way he talked that made it easy to listen. I found myself smiling without realizing it. He helped me replace the filter in the furnace later that afternoon. It wasn't a two-person job, but he offered, and I didn't say no. At one point, I was standing on the second stair of the stepladder, holding the edge of the ceiling vent open, when I realized his hand was resting lightly at my lower back. Not pushing, not pulling, just there for balance. I didn't move right away. The contact was brief, only a few seconds, but it stayed with me long after he walked back to the kitchen for the screwdriver. That evening, after dinner, I heard the TV playing in the living room. I went to grab my book from the shelf and saw him sitting on the floor, legs crossed, remote in hand, eyes fixed on the screen. He'd found the old box of DVDs we kept in the bottom drawer, home movies, birthdays, pool parties, Christmas mornings from years that felt distant now. On the screen was a recording I hadn't seen in over a decade, a summer barbecue. I was in a bathing suit, hair wet, laughing at something just off camera. Trevor must have been around 14 then, the one holding the camcorder. I stood quietly by the doorway watching him watch it. He didn't turn his head, didn't skip ahead. Just sat there, elbows resting on his knees, as if he were studying something important. My image flickered on the screen, younger, less tired, unaware. Something about it felt strange. Not wrong exactly, but too still, like the air before a thunderstorm. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. After a minute, I turned away and walked upstairs, every step a little too deliberate. I closed my bedroom door, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for a while. I told myself it was just nostalgia, that he'd found the tapes by accident, that I was making something out of nothing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was a shift. Small, quiet, but there. And once something shifts, even just a little, it doesn't shift back. The morning started quietly without anything unusual breaking the rhythm I had come to expect in that house during Dan's absences. When I walked into the kitchen, I was already halfway expecting to find the smell of coffee or the sound of the refrigerator clicking off the defrost cycle, but instead there was a mug on the counter already filled with the exact tea I usually made myself every morning, and beside it a folded paper towel that had caught the first few drops like someone had taken time to make it without rushing. When I asked Trevor how he knew, he smiled without looking up and said he remembered from last time, even though I couldn't recall ever telling him anything about my tea preferences. For some reason, that small detail stuck with me all day in a way I couldn't explain. He didn't leave the house that day, even though it was warm outside and the kind of Sunday that usually calls for errands or coffee shops or headphones and sidewalks. Instead, he moved around the rooms like he was trying to be useful in the way that doesn't draw attention. I noticed it especially in the kitchen, when I went to take out the trash and he was already tying the bag, or when he found the stool in the garage and wiped the dust from the top of the fridge without anyone asking. It wasn't overbearing or theatrical. It was just quiet presence that felt more deliberate than casual. Later, we stood near the living room shelf talking casually about what to watch that night. While I flipped through the usual streaming apps, he mentioned a show I had only thought about watching a few weeks ago, something I didn't remember ever saying out loud. I looked at him then, trying to remember if I had, and maybe I had. Maybe it had slipped out in some passing sentence. But even so, the way he suggested it so lightly made me feel like we were already halfway into a conversation I didn't know we'd started. At lunch, the moment happened quickly and without ceremony. His arm brushed mine near the sink as I was, reaching for the towel. It wasn't dramatic or inappropriate or even deliberate, really, but it happened, and I didn't move immediately. When I did, it wasn't because I was uncomfortable. It was because I realized I hadn't moved. And then, I wasn't sure if I had moved because I wanted to or because I felt like I should have. That confusion stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit, and the rest of the meal passed with soft clinks of silverware and no mention of anything that might have changed in that tiny space between us. In the afternoon, I went outside to collect a package. When I turned around, I saw him at the window looking down at me, not smiling, not waving, just watching. There was something in that stillness that made the air around me feel heavier, and the distance between the front yard and the living room window suddenly felt like a border between two places that were part of the same house but didn't share the same rules. I turned back toward the door quickly, not because I felt unsafe, but because I didn't want to ask myself why he was watching and what I expected him to do instead. That evening, while I was folding laundry in the hallway, he walked into the kitchen and set down a tray with 2 cups, one of which was a pale blue mug with a worn gold rim and a small crack near the handle, the one I had received as a gift the Christmas before last, and which I had not taken out of the cabinet in over a year. I stood there staring at it for longer than I should have, and when I looked at him, he was already walking back toward the living room without saying anything at all, as if the cup had chosen itself and I was supposed to understand why. When I went to bed, I didn't close the door, which was not something I usually did. It wasn't because I forgot or because I was waiting for anything to happen. It was just that the air in the house was warm and thick, and I told myself it helped. Circulation. But part of me also felt like closing the door would mean admitting that it should have been closed, and I wasn't ready to do that. Not because I wanted something to happen, but because I didn't know what it would mean if I was thinking about it at all. Somewhere deep in the night, I wasn't fully asleep when I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. They were soft and slow and stopped just outside my door. I waited without moving for what felt like a full minute, and when nothing followed, not a knock, not a word, not a creak, I opened my eyes in the dark and listened to the silence pressing against the walls around me. I felt a kind of stillness settle in my chest that didn't go away, even when I finally drifted off hours later. The next morning, I stayed in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because something about the quiet outside my room felt different, and I didn't want to meet it too soon. When I finally got up and walked into the hallway, I noticed the door to the guest room was slightly open, but the bed inside had already been made and the blanket folded in that precise way that people do when they're trying not to seem like they've been there at all. It made me wonder whether Trevor had been up for hours or whether he had never really gone to sleep either. In the kitchen, the same mug was waiting again, the one I used every morning with the small chip under the handle, placed carefully, next to a folded napkin, and the tea was already steeped at just the right strength. When I reached for it, I realized he had been watching from the corner by the pantry, holding his own cup with both hands as if he didn't want to say anything first. For a moment we stood in that silence that wasn't cold, but also wasn't casual, like a hallway you step into when you're not sure which way you meant to go. We both sat down and ate quietly at the kitchen island, and even though nothing was said, there was a sense that something had been acknowledged, not in words, but in the way we didn't look away when our eyes met, or in the way we passed the butter slowly. Like the gesture itself required a level of focus neither of us wanted to explain. When breakfast ended, I offered to clean up, but he moved first and took the plates and stood at the sink like he had done it 100 times already, which maybe he had back when he was younger and used to visit, but it didn't feel like a child's memory. It felt like something else. Later that afternoon, I walked through the living room to open the curtains, because the light outside had started shifting toward that soft, late summer gold that made the house feel warmer and less artificial. And I noticed that he had left a book face down on the armrest of the couch, the same novel I had read last winter during a time when I didn't want to talk to anyone. I wondered if he had brought it with him or found it in the back of the hallway bookshelf, because either way he had chosen something I didn't expect him to even know about. We didn't talk much that day except for small comments about the weather and whether the groceries needed restocking, but none of it was filler and none of it felt forced. In between those exchanges, I caught myself listening for his footsteps when he moved upstairs, or noticing how many times he passed through the same doorway, as if his movement alone kept some kind of pulse going in the house that hadn't been there before. At one point, I went to water the plants on the front porch and left the door slightly ajar. When I looked back from the third step, I saw him standing just inside the hallway watching me, not with intensity or any kind of inappropriate expression, but with something that felt deeply present and unflinching, as if he were memorizing the way light fell on my shoulders or the way my hands moved when I adjusted the stems. I told myself it was nothing, just curiosity, just observation. But the truth was I didn't want to know what it really meant. That night, the power flickered once as I was loading the dishwasher, and the small jolt of darkness made me turn quickly, but he was already behind me holding a flashlight from the emergency drawer. I didn't hear him come in, and I didn't ask how he knew where it was. We stood there a little too close for a little too long as the power blinked back on, and when the lights returned, I found myself staring at the wall instead of him, just to break the tension that neither of us mentioned. Before bed, I walked into the guest room to drop off a clean towel and noticed that he had organized the small bookshelf with my husband's old paperbacks, arranging them not alphabetically or by size, but in a way that showed he had taken time to think about it. Next to them was that same DVD box from the night before, left slightly open as if someone had watched more than just one recording, and the TV remote lay beside it angled in the same direction I had left it weeks ago, which made me wonder whether he had paused on something specific or just let the past play in the background like a familiar song. That night, I again left my bedroom door slightly open, telling myself the air circulation was better that way, and that it had nothing to do with what might or might not happen. I lay awake longer than I wanted to, just listening to the way the house settled and how every sound felt like it came from closer than it should have. At one point, I heard soft movement down the hall. Not loud and not continuous, but with a rhythm that suggested someone was deciding something, then changing their mind and eventually returning to silence. I closed my eyes and let the dark settle in again. Not because I was at peace, but because I didn't know what else to do. When sleep finally came, it was the kind that doesn't rest you completely, just takes you far enough from your own thoughts to make the hours pass until the morning light returns through the window, and you pretend the stillness you felt overnight was only in your imagination, even though you know better. The day started with the kind of gray light that made everything in the house feel heavier than it really was. The clouds outside pressed low against the tops of the trees in the yard. The internet had gone out sometime overnight, which meant the soft hum of background distraction was missing, and in its absence the quiet became something sharp and noticeable, like a room that had been waiting for a conversation that never came. I sat in the dining room with my laptop open and my fingers resting on the keyboard without moving, while the screen blinked back at me with the same paragraph I had been trying to finish since yesterday morning. He was already in the living room by the time I gave up trying to write. From where I sat, I could see him sitting on the far end of the couch with a book open in his hands and his legs stretched out in front of him. He looked comfortable in a way that didn't feel temporary, and even though I knew he had other places he could have been, I also knew without asking that he had no intention of going anywhere. When I stepped into the room, he didn't speak, just moved slightly over, giving me space to sit. But the space wasn't much, and when I settled into the cushion beside him, I noticed our knees almost touched, and neither of us made any effort to correct that. He shifted closer until our shoulders nearly touched. I pretended to focus on the screen in front of me, scrolling back through the same paragraph for the third time. My eyes couldn't seem to move past the same sentence. I could feel the warmth from his arm radiating through the space between us that was now too small to ignore. And still I stayed where I was because moving away would have meant admitting that I noticed how close he'd come. And I wasn't ready to admit that out loud, not even to myself. He reached across me and handed me a cup of tea, the same blend from the day before, already steeped to the color I liked. The cup was warm, and his fingers touched mine, just barely, but enough to notice. I didn't pull away at first because the contact wasn't demanding or inappropriate. It was just there, simple and direct, and for a second too long. When I finally took the cup fully into my hands, I could feel my pulse in my wrists, as if it had moved there all at once and refused to leave quietly. He looked at me then, and it wasn't a glance or an accident. It was direct and still. I tried to hold that gaze like it was no different from any other, but it was, and I knew it, and so did he. After a moment, I looked away, not out of shame, but because the longer I looked back, the more I felt myself letting something rise that I had tried very hard to keep buried under politeness and structure, and all the invisible lines we both knew we were standing too close to. He leaned in just slightly, his hand moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that didn't ask permission but waited for refusal. When it didn't come, his palm rested gently on my shoulder, and the heat from his skin moved through the fabric of my shirt like it belonged there. My eyes closed without thinking, not out of fear or hesitation, but because I couldn't hold the weight of that moment while looking at him and still pretend nothing was happening. When he moved even closer and the space between us disappeared entirely, our breath felt like part of the same rhythm. The kiss, when it came, was quiet and quick but deep in a way that made me feel like something inside had been pushed out of place. When I kissed him back, it was without thought or calculation, only response. His hand slid around to the small of my back while mine gripped the edge of the cushion beneath me, as if that alone could keep the room from tipping forward. The knock on the door came like a lightning strike, and I jumped back immediately, heart pounding and hands unsteady. I stood up so fast the cup on my lap tipped slightly and spilled a few drops onto the rug, and I didn't stop to clean it because I was already halfway to the door. My voice caught in my throat when I opened it and saw who was there. A friend I hadn't seen in months, all bright eyes and casual joy, who wrapped her arms around me before I could process anything and asked how I'd been, as if she hadn't. Just interrupted something that neither of us had found the words to explain, even to ourselves. I stepped back from the doorway, trying to steady my hands without making it obvious, and invited her inside with a voice that sounded far too bright for what I was actually feeling. As she walked ahead of me into the living room, I could still feel the air buzzing with something unspoken that hadn't cleared and maybe wouldn't for a while. When I turned my head to glance behind me, Trevor was already gone down the hallway, out of sight, and that absence hit harder than I expected, as if the room had just released a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. I stood for one extra second, trying to quiet something inside before following her in. She made herself at home immediately, which was her way. Opening the cabinets without asking, pouring coffee, talking about her new job and the awful parking, lauded her gym and the last trip she took with her sister to Wisconsin Dells. I nodded in all the right places, smiled where I was supposed to, smiled wider when her eyes caught mine. But underneath that surface, I could still feel the residue of what had just happened minutes before, and I kept my eyes away from the hallway, even though I was sure I could sense him standing just out of view, waiting for the air to shift again. I sat with her at the kitchen island while she rambled in her usual rhythm, comfortable and easy and familiar, and I kept my hands wrapped around a cold cup just to give them something to do. I let her fill the space with stories that barely registered and updates I had no reason to remember. Every now and then I nodded or gave a short reply, just enough to keep the pace moving while I tried to remind my body how to breathe normally again, because it still felt like something was wrapped around my ribs too tightly to take a full breath. At one point, she laughed too loudly at something I barely heard and reached for my hand across the table, the same hand that had been resting just minutes ago on the edge of the couch next to his. When her fingers touched mine, I flinched ever so slightly, not because of her touch, but because the contrast was too much and the memory too fresh. When she let go and leaned back in her chair, I felt the sudden weight of guilt land heavily, behind my sternum, as if it had just remembered where to find me. The mug from earlier was still on the floor beneath the armrest, not broken, but with a faint ring of tea around its base. I reached down and picked it up while she talked about something to do with her neighbor's dog, and for a long second I just held it in both hands, feeling how the warmth was gone but the memory of heat remained. I walked it over to the sink without washing it, and left it there, unsure if leaving it dirty was an act of defiance or avoidance or something else I wasn't ready to name. She finally paused long enough to ask how I was, and her tone didn't match the question. Light and casual, like she didn't want to spook whatever might be hiding under the surface. I answered too quickly, too brightly, something about work and errands and how I hadn't been sleeping well lately but was fine, and I smiled after I said it just to sell the line. But I could feel how thin it sounded even as it left my mouth, and the second she looked away I let the smile drop, because keeping it up felt like holding a plank that had gone on too long. When she finally stood to leave, I walked her to the door like nothing was wrong and thanked her for coming by and told her we should do this again soon, and the words felt like they came from someone else, because the whole time I was watching her shoes cross the threshold and feeling my heartbeat slow in a way I hadn't realized it was racing, and when the door clicked shut behind her, I leaned against it for a full minute, not moving, just letting the silence return to the house like water filling back into a room after something heavy had been pulled out. I walked slowly down the hallway, not sure if he would be there or if he had gone upstairs or back to the guest room or maybe even left the house entirely. But when I reached the living room, I saw him sitting again on the same side of the couch, his arms resting on his knees, his hands folded together, and his head slightly down like he wasn't sure if he should look up. When he finally did, his face was unreadable. Not blank, but careful, like someone waiting to see how badly they'd just broken something. Neither of us spoke for a while, and I stood near the corner of the room, one hand still on the wall just for balance even though I didn't need it. When I finally walked toward him, it wasn't to sit back down or explain anything or ask what that had been or what came next. It was just to be there, in the same room again, and not pretend we were strangers who hadn't felt what we felt, or done what we'd done. I picked up the cushion that had shifted and set it straight again, and he stood quietly and walked past me toward the hallway, not touching me, not brushing against me, just close enough that I could feel the warmth of him as he passed. I turned toward the window and stared outside, where the sky was still gray but lighter now, and I stood there listening to the quiet behind me, wondering whether the air had actually changed, or if I was just more aware of how much space silence can take up when you let it. When I finally walked back to the kitchen, the mug was still in the sink exactly where I had left it, and the tea inside had turned cold and still. I picked it up again without rinsing it and held it under the faucet for a moment, not turning on the water, not yet, just letting it sit there waiting like it might decide on its own whether it should be cleaned or thrown away. After my friend left, I moved through the house like nothing had changed, and he did the same with that steady kind of stillness he always carried when he wanted to keep things from spilling over. We exchanged the same polite motions around the kitchen and hallway, and neither of us brought up the morning or the silence or the way we had sat too close and stayed too quiet and let things unfold in a space where they never should have. Everything between us took on that heavy, invisible quality, like a wall too thick to see through but somehow always present in the room, even when our backs were turned to it. I spent the next hour cleaning the parts of the house that were already clean and telling myself it was just routine. But the truth was, I needed to scrub every surface that might have held a trace of what I wasn't ready to confront. I started with the guest blanket, even though it had barely been touched, folded it tightly and stored it away without a crease, then pulled the throw pillows from the couch and replaced the tablecloth and vacuumed the rug twice over in slow, deliberate rouse while the tea kettle hissed behind me and the silence stretched between walls that had heard too much. When I opened the window to let air in, I wasn't thinking about scent or circulation. I just needed something from outside, to break the rhythm of the house. I found myself wiping doorknobs and spraying cleaner over tile that hadn't been stained, just to give myself something to hold on to that didn't look like memory. And by the time the sun had shifted against the far wall, I had scrubbed away everything visible but felt like I had done nothing at all. The next morning, Dan sent a message saying he might come home a day early, and without thinking, I typed back that I was feeling off. Maybe a fever or a migraine or something I couldn't name. As soon as I hit send, I hated the lie, but also knew I couldn't take it back. Because the idea of him returning to a house that had changed without him noticing terrified me more than anything he might have asked. When he replied telling me to rest and that he'd stay one more day, I placed the phone face down on the counter and stared at the wall like it might give me permission to breathe. That evening, Trevor appeared in the doorway while I was rinsing plates and asked if I needed help organizing the old folders in the garage. I shook my head and said no too quickly, but he didn't say anything else, just turned and disappeared down the hallway. A few minutes later, without any good reason, I followed and walked through the back door into the thick, warm air of the garage, where the scent of old paper and oil wrapped around me like something I hadn't missed until it returned. He was standing near the tall metal shelf with his back turned, one hand resting on a box labeled kitchen, and I paused just outside the light, waiting to see if he would speak. But he didn't. I stepped forward slowly toward the corner where the holiday decorations were stored, pretending to reach for something I didn't need, because the idea of not moving felt too exposed. When he finally stepped past me to adjust a stack of crates, our bodies brushed just enough to make the air stop between us again, and neither of us flinched or spoke or shifted, and still that single passing held everything the morning had not said. We didn't speak the rest of the evening, but the quiet didn't loosen. And when I crossed the hallway that night heading toward the kitchen, he stepped out of the bathroom at the same time, and we stopped and looked at each other for half a second too long. I said something about needing water just to give the moment shape, but when I walked forward, he stepped back slowly and made room without stepping away. For one breath, I thought he might touch me again, but he didn't, and I kept walking as the creak of floorboards followed behind me like a question we both heard, but neither answered. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm and lay still, under the sheets, staring at the ceiling that looked no different than it had the day before, but somehow felt farther away, as if the room itself had grown or shifted in the night. I stayed like that for a long time, not moving, not blinking, just letting the weight of everything settle into my chest until it felt solid enough to carry into the kitchen, where the smell of coffee reached me before I turned the corner, and I saw him already there, moving slowly like he had always been part of the morning routine, even though we both knew that wasn't true. We didn't say anything beyond the usual good morning, and I thanked him for the coffee, and he nodded without looking up. We sat in our usual places across from each other and both pretended to check our phones, and neither of us touched the breakfast toast that sat cooling on the edge of the plate. The quiet felt like something we were both trying to protect, because even a single wrong word would have pulled everything back up to the surface where it would no longer be deniable or soft or distant. After he left the table, I stood alone in the kitchen for a while, watching the steam rise from the cup I hadn't finished and thinking about Dan's message from the night before, about how he'd check in again that afternoon and maybe head back in the evening if I felt better. I didn't know what I wanted anymore, didn't know whether to be relieved or panicked, because the idea of normal felt farther away than it should have, and I didn't know if I could put it back on like a coat that no longer fit. Later that afternoon, I folded laundry on the bed, and when I went to return the stack of towels to the closet, he was there again by the end of the hallway, turning toward me as I stepped through, and I nodded, and he nodded, and the whole exchange lasted less than 5 seconds, but it stayed with me all the way down the stairs like something important had been decided or left unsaid or both. I found myself standing at the bottom step longer than I should have, not because I was stuck, but because I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do next. That night, the power flickered once as I was finishing the dishes, and I turned instinctively toward the hallway and saw him standing there, already watching. For a moment, neither of us moved, and the sound of the refrigerator filled the room with a hum that sounded louder than it ever had. When he finally stepped away and disappeared again, I closed my eyes and counted to 10 before I turned off the lights and walked upstairs one step at a time, not because I was tired, but because anything faster would have felt like a decision. I met him again in the hallway near midnight. I was holding an empty glass, not because I needed water, but because I needed something to hold. When he saw me, he didn't smile or speak, just stepped to the side and waited, and I walked past him with my eyes on the floor. The moment stretched again between our shoulders, and my arm brushed his slightly, just enough for me to feel how tense the space had become. Then we were in our separate rooms again, doors closing gently like book covers, hiding chapters that were still being written in the dark. And when I laid down, I stared at the ceiling again and thought about how many lines we had already crossed, and how many more there were, and how some of them felt like they had been drawn in chalk that could still be washed away, while others felt carved deep into something older, something I couldn't name but would still have to carry even after no one else could see them anymore. I woke up before the sun rose, with that specific kind of tightness in my chest that didn't feel like fear exactly, but more like a quiet warning, a pulse beneath the surface that wouldn't go still, and I stayed under the covers for longer than necessary, staring at the lines of shadow on the ceiling and listening for sounds that weren't there, because the house felt too still, like something had settled during the night, and I hadn't noticed it until everything else was silent. When I finally stood up and moved to the bathroom, the floor felt colder than usual, and even the water from the tap seemed slow, as if the whole house was running on a rhythm I didn't belong to anymore. He was already in the kitchen by the time I walked in, moving without hurry, pouring coffee into 2 mugs without asking how I wanted mine, and I sat down at the table with the morning paper open in front of me, not reading it, just watching the way the steam rose from the cup. When he mentioned quietly that we could drive out to the lake house if I wanted, just for a change of air, just for the day, I didn't answer right away, but my hands moved to fold the paper, and I nodded before I understood why I was nodding. And somehow I already knew he had planned for that answer before he said the words aloud. The drive took an hour, and neither of us said much, and the music played low from the speakers, but it only filled the space between words that weren't spoken. And I watched the trees blur past the window while he kept his eyes on the road, and both of us sat in that kind of shared silence that doesn't feel tense exactly, just suspended, like a breath held too long. When we pulled off the highway onto the gravel path, the sound of tires crunching felt louder than it should have, and the house appeared up ahead exactly as I remembered it, though I hadn't seen it in years. The key was still under the stone, near the porch, just like always, and he reached for it without asking, and I didn't say anything as we stepped inside, and the smell of old fabric and dust wrapped around me instantly, like a coat I hadn't worn in years. We opened the windows slowly, one by one, letting in the breeze that carried pine and water and something sharp that felt like memory. And we moved through the house with small steps, brushing off chairs, shaking out the old blanket from the back of the sofa, and removing the table cover like we had done this a dozen times before, even though we hadn't done it once together. We didn't speak while we worked, not really, and when the table was cleared and the windows were all open and the light had shifted just enough to make the space feel lived in again, I turned and looked at him standing by the far wall near the window, and I crossed the room slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because each step felt like a sentence I couldn't yet form. When I reached him, he didn't move, and my hands came to rest against his chest, and his breath hitched once, but his eyes didn't close, and mine didn't either. And for a moment we just stood there in the middle of that stillness, like everything else had been pulled away to give us this one uninterruptible space. There were no words during or after, and when we sat down on the edge of the old sofa facing the window, I rested my hand on his shoulder and he placed his on my knee, and we didn't touch in any other way, didn't lean in or pull back or speak, just sat like that with the air drifting in through the screen and the afternoon folding in around us. And I stared out at the trees and the glint of the lake through the branches and felt something inside me loosen. Not in relief and not in fear, but in that strange middle ground where nothing is decided, yet everything has already begun. When we were almost home, the sun just starting to fall low behind the rooftops, I saw the black car pulled off to the side of the road, not parked like it belonged there and not broken down either, just waiting. And I didn't think much of it at first, but the shape of it stayed in my mind. And something about the stillness of the figure behind the wheel made me shift in my seat. By the time we turned the corner onto our street, I had already forgotten the license plate, but not the feeling it left behind. When we pulled into the driveway, I stepped out of the car slower than usual, letting the evening air settle around me while he grabbed the leftover blanket from the back seat and carried it to the porch without a word, and I followed behind him with the quiet feeling that something was unfinished, like a note left hanging at the end of a song. When I entered the house, the first thing I noticed was how ordinary it looked, exactly as we had left it, with nothing out of place. And yet the air felt heavier, as if the walls had absorbed something unspoken that neither of us had the language to touch. I placed my phone on the counter and stood for a while, staring out the window, watching the way the sky shifted through shades of orange and blue, and I could hear him upstairs, moving around softly. And I didn't call out or follow, because I didn't want to say anything that would pull the moment into something it wasn't ready to be. After a while, I went outside to shake the dust off my coat, and when I opened the screen door, I saw it sitting there, just past the step. A plain envelope, not marked, not addressed, not even sealed, just resting like it belonged and hadn't. Just appeared there with no sound, no warning, no explanation. I crouched down and picked it up slowly, already knowing before I opened it that whatever was inside wasn't going to be casual or forgettable. When I lifted the flap and slid the contents into my hand, I felt the breath leave my body in one long, silent motion, because there in the fading light was a photo printed on thick paper, the kind that doesn't bend easily. And the image was simple, a single frame showing the side of the lake house taken from the woods where the trees thinned near the back porch. It was taken from enough distance that the house filled the center, but close enough that details weren't lost. The angle of the photo was exact and intentional, the composition too clean to be accidental. The figure of him standing near the window was unmistakable, his height, his posture, his clothes all visible, and my own silhouette facing him, not blurred or hidden but clear, as if caught in the middle of movement, frozen in a frame that had never been meant to be taken. The window we had sat beside was open, the curtain lifted by the wind, and behind us the empty room full of light and silence. And everything we hadn't said was now embedded in the lines and shadows of that single image. I stood there holding that single image, my fingers curled around the edges of the paper, and the sound of a car passed slowly on the street. I didn't turn around. I didn't move at all, because all I could think about was the way it felt to be watched and not know, and how exposed that moment had been, and how someone had known where to stand and when to press the shutter, and what exactly to capture to make the entire truth collapse inward without even using a single word or name. When I finally walked back inside, I didn't mention it and I didn't ask any questions, because the weight of the envelope in my pocket said enough, and the quiet between us said the rest. I placed the photo inside the drawer near the phone, where no one would find it easily, but not hidden either, and I stood there for a long time with the drawer still open, letting the truth of it settle in my stomach like a stone, because whatever had been unspoken before now lived in print and could not be undone or unknown. I lay awake, listening for sounds that didn't come, and watching the patterns of headlights move across the ceiling. Each one felt like a question aimed too directly at the space I had tried to protect, and even when the house was still and nothing stirred, I couldn't close my eyes, because part of me was still standing on that porch, holding proof in my hands, that what I thought we had kept between us had already been seen from the outside. The next morning, I didn't mention the photograph, and he didn't ask. We moved around the kitchen like people who had shared a long drive but not a long silence, and when I poured coffee into the same 2 mugs we had used the day before, I noticed my hands were steady, even though nothing inside me felt still. The clink of the spoon against ceramic sounded too loud in the quiet, and I wondered whether he could hear how forced my movements had become, or whether he had decided not to listen anymore, because whatever needed to be said had already been said in other ways. I walked through the house, checking windows, checking lights, wiping the counters twice over, even though they didn't need it. When I opened the pantry to grab the last of the cereal, I saw the envelope tucked beside the flour sack, just far enough back that I knew it hadn't slipped there on accident. When I pulled it free, the weight of it was wrong. Too flat. Too rigid. And I already knew before I opened it that it wasn't another photo. Inside, there was no note, just a small plastic flash drive with no label and no markings, just silence in a different form. I plugged it into the side of the laptop and waited, and the screen opened on a single file with no name, no date, just a timestamp that made my stomach twist before I even clicked. The video played in grainy night vision, black and white, slow and steady. And I watched myself moving through the kitchen, flipping off the light, wiping my hands on the towel, standing still for too long before walking down the hallway. Then came the frame that didn't move fast enough, the image of the back door creaking open and him stepping through carefully, like he had done it before. The camera was fixed high, just under the roof, angled toward the back of the house, exactly where no one ever looked. The picture wasn't perfectly clear, but it didn't need to be, because I knew every movement, every pause, every gesture. When I saw myself come back down the hall and stop and wait and not close the door behind him, the air left the room, like someone had shut a valve. I didn't even press pause because there was no point in slowing down something that had already happened. The signature was scrawled across the final frame, not typed, not digital, written in blue ink across a printed screen capture, as if whoever had left it wanted me to hold the weight of the paper in my hand, to feel it, to know it was real. The words weren't a threat or a question, just a sentence shaped like a verdict. I didn't say anything when I turned off the screen and closed the laptop and put the drive in the drawer with the photograph, because silence had already become the language of the house, and I was starting to understand how fluent I had become in using it. I went to work that afternoon, even though I shouldn't have, even though I spent the drive gripping the steering wheel so tight my fingers ached. When I came home, I knew before I opened the door that something had changed, because the lights were off, the air was different, and the smell of him wasn't there anymore. I walked from room to room looking for signs, and there weren't many. Just the missing coat by the door, the empty drawer in the dresser, and the bare hook where his keys used to hang. There was no note, no voicemail, no sign that anything had ended except for the empty spaces where he used to be. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands in my lap, waiting for the sound of his car returning, even though I knew it wouldn't come. And when my phone buzzed, I grabbed it too quickly and saw it was our daughter. Just a short message asking if I was okay, saying Dad told her I'd been tired lately, and maybe it wasn't the best weekend for a visit. And her words weren't sharp or questioning, just polite and slightly distant, like someone repeating something they were told, and I typed back that I loved her and hoped her classes were going well and that we would see each other soon, even though I didn't know when or how. That night, The quiet in the house was different. Not the same kind of charged stillness that had lived here for weeks, but something emptied, something clean. And when I walked past the mirror in the hallway, I didn't look away this time. And what I saw didn't feel like me, not exactly, not anymore. Because what looked back wasn't someone broken or angry or young. It was someone who had chosen something and then chosen to keep it quiet. And now all that was left was the shape of those choices written in lines that hadn't been there before. And I stood there longer than I should have, not to mourn what had gone, but to acknowledge what had replaced it. The mirror didn't blink and didn't forgive, and I stood there longer than I wanted to, tracing the outline of someone who had once looked more certain of the space she took up. And now that reflection showed only the echo of every step I hadn't meant to take, and the longer I stared, the more the glass felt like water. Like if I moved too quickly, the image would ripple and lose what little structure it still held. So I turned away and walked down the hall, where every floorboard creaked differently now, as if the house itself was testing whether I could still walk through it without flinching. The kitchen light was off, but I could still see the note under the magnet near the fridge. A folded piece of paper with handwriting I recognized too. Quickly. And the message was short and printed in black marker. Not rushed, but not careful either, and it said only what it needed to say and nothing more. You know what we did. I do too. And the words were like a breath held just behind my ribs. Not angry, not cruel, just final. And that piece of paper said, more than any long apology or tearful confession ever could. And I folded it and placed it next to the photograph in the drawer without rereading it, because once was already enough. The house felt emptier that day, not because someone had left, but because everything that had once filled the space between walls was now thinner, harder to touch. And when I opened the windows just after noon, the wind moved through too easily, like there was nothing left for it to bounce against. No warmth, no laughter, no resistance. Just air through an empty frame. And I walked slowly through each room, not to look for him or for what we had lost, but to understand the new dimensions of what was still mine, because even absence leaves a shape if you wait long enough to see it clearly. By evening, the light fell in sharper angles across the floor, and I made dinner without appetite, without sound, and set the plate down at the table but never sat. And when the phone rang, I let it go to voicemail. And when the streetlight outside flickered on, I didn't bother closing the curtains, because there was no one left to ask who might be watching, and when I finally walked upstairs, the hallway felt longer than usual. Like the house was stretching out behind me in case I changed my mind and needed a way back to something I couldn't claim anymore. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at the bed like it was something unfamiliar, a shape I hadn't seen before. And I stepped inside slowly and opened the window without really knowing why. Maybe to let something out, maybe to invite something in, or maybe because the air needed another place to go. And when I sat on the edge of the mattress with my hands in my lap and my shoulders pulled in against the chill, I listened to the wind as it moved through the house, pulling against the curtains, rustling against the walls, and filling the silence with a sound that wasn't quite comfort and wasn't quite blame. The house didn't answer, and neither did the night. And I stayed like that until the sky darkened fully and the floor cooled beneath my feet, and the only sound left was the pulse in my own ears. And I let it carry me backward through everything, not as a memory and not as regret, but as fact. Because what had happened could not be changed, and what had been given could not be taken back, and whatever came next would arrive, not because it was deserved, but because it was next. And when I finally lay down on the bed with the window still open and the night pressing in through the screen, I knew the house would not forget. And neither would I, because even if no one else ever said it aloud, and even if no one ever came back to ask what had happened, the walls had heard the truth and the floor had held it, and the wind would carry it long after the doors had closed.